Ready? Yeah. All right. Well, Larry, today is Wednesday, May 16th, 2018, and we are at Moline Public Library in Moline, Illinois. My name is Joe Lavin. I will be interviewing Larry Uelk. Elk.
Right.
For the Illinois Veterans History Project on behalf of Moline Public Library. Larry was born on October 14th, 1944, and is 73 years old. Also present is Shiv Puri. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for being a part of our project, and thank you for serving this awesome country. I just wanted to start and ask just your biological details, like where and when were you born, and how long have you been here in the Quad Cities?
I was born in St. Louis.
Okay.
And I lived there until I was 21. That's when I went into the Air Force. I was in the Air Force for 4 years and then got out, went to college then. I was a slow burner, you might say. But it was the best thing that could have happened to me. Some people know what they want to do when they get out of high school. Some people don't. I didn't. And the Air Force just really opened up a whole different world to me. So in the Air Force, I moved to Texas for a while, for about a year.
Okay.
And then I lived in Massachusetts. And then I lived in Hawaii for 2 years. And from Hawaii, I traveled all over the Far East. It was during the Vietnam War. And I came back and lived near Rolla, Missouri. And I ran a cow-calf operation while I went to school. And that's a story in itself because I grew up in the suburbs. But another time we can talk about that. So then when I graduated, I ended up working for Ralston Purina, and I stayed mostly in Missouri. Was with Ralston for 10 years, and then moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana. From there, I went eventually to Muscatine, Iowa. And I was with that company, Kent Feeds, for about 6 years, and then I moved to California for about 10. I lived in about an hour from Salinas, California, which is about an hour from, if you play golf, from Pebble Beach.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
But I was really in the rural area, in the heart of the agricultural valley of California. And I came back here to the Midwest about 4 years ago.
Okay. Very cool. Diving into your days in the Air Force. So you said you were Air Force?
Right.
Or, yeah. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
Well, at that time, it was just a matter of time you were going to go in.
Okay.
And I had some relatives that were in World War II, and one was in infantry, one was operated a bulldozer, one was a supply sergeant. And I just thought if I get drafted, it's going to be a 2-year thing. More than likely, I would end up, learning how to shoot a gun and then get out in 2 years. And I thought if I'm going to go in and I'm going to survive, I might just as well try to find something that I can learn while I'm in, other than just being, a combat veteran type person. So I interviewed all the different agencies. I went to the Navy, I went to the Marines, I went to the Army, and I went to the Air Force. And the Air Force really offered me, after I took they make you take a test. Mm-hmm. After I took the test, they really offered me the most in the way of doing things besides just being in a war type situation. Mm-hmm. So when I took the test, the recruiter went over the different options because I could pretty well go in any field I wanted, except electronics. Math was not my thing. And I decided that I wanted to be a Blue Beret. And Blue Berets were a little bit different than Green Berets in that they not only had to be like a Green Beret, but they also had to be like aircraft controllers to communicate with the fighters and the bombers and let them know where exactly to drop their bombs or maybe where the enemy was hiding. Today it's a more sophisticated position because they use a lot of lasers and stuff like that. But anyway, so the recruiter agreed with me that that would be a great job. About a week later he called me up and he said they declined because I wear glasses.
Oh, wow.
And he said they don't want you jumping in some jungle and breaking your glasses, and then you're of no good to anybody.
Yeah.
So he said, but I think because of your age and because of the scores you had on your test, you'll probably end up with something that would be of interest to you. So I went in, did basic. After about 2 weeks in basic, the whole thing was about 6 weeks long. Myself and maybe 4 or 5 others from what they call flight, which is a group of guys. We were called out and we had to answer a lot of questions, and what we didn't know we were doing, we were basically filling out an application to see what type of a clearance we would get.
Mm.
And I ended up getting a top secret crypto, no foreign, N-O-F-O-R-N, that means no foreigner would be able to see that material. And in code word. And code word basically had to do with what we intercepted from other countries, and decrypted it.
Wow.
So I was pretty well cleared for almost anything that I would have a need to know.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't have a need to know that stuff, I would not be exposed to it. So I ended up in a division called the Security Service. And they basically had 2 sections. They had the one section that focused on our enemies, and you would listen to their communications, and you would try to break their codes, and then if you did, you had analysts who would then read that information. But then they had another group that listened to our own people. Not citizens, but if you ever go onto a military installation and you go into an office, you'll see that the phones usually have a sticker on them and they say, do not discuss classified information over this phone, because they're not secure. So they have secure phones, but they usually are not in a regular office. So many times what we would do, we would be invited to a base and we would basically go into the telephone operations center, plug in our tape recorders, and we would listen to people.
Wow.
And if they were personal calls, we would shut the recorder off, back it up, and then record over that, because we were not allowed to record any personal calls. But any calls base to base, any radio calls or anything like that, we were able to record those. And then we would try to glean, classified information out of these conversations. And if people discussed classified information, then we would then write them up. We wouldn't use names necessarily, but often a base commander would invite us in just to let people know that, well, there was a saying in World War II, it was loose lips sink ships. So, somebody was going to ship out the next day, and he said, I'm shipping out at 10 o'clock in the morning on this particular ship. You never know who's going to know that. Mm-hmm. And somebody could pass that information on to the Germans or what have you, and they could have had a submarine waiting for somebody. And believe me, it happened. Mm-hmm. So, when you start off in security service, you basically transcribe. So that's about the lowest level you can have in security service. But it's also kind of interesting because you're actually listening to the conversations and you're trying to type at the same time. And you're trying to figure out where the headquarters is of a particular, let's say, tactical base or maybe a strategic air command base. And they would change their call signs every month. And so we would then every month we would try to figure out who changed what call signs, and we would try to rebuild this network of operations again. The whole point being that if we were doing it, if we were able to figure out these call signs and figure out the chain of command of different bases, then we knew the Russians were doing it. Because they were doing it a lot more seriously than we were. So then from a transcriber, the next step would be you would go up to the position of an analyst. And the analyst then reads what has been transcribed. So he or she is the one who reads the stuff, and they try to pick out different things that might be considered classified or sensitive. I had a couple of really interesting conversations that I was able to intercept, and that's what we were called radio interception operators. There was one of President Johnson talking to one of his key aides. And I heard the whole thing. His aide was in a plane, and Johnson was talking to him. And there was a threat of a railroad strike at the time. And Johnson was talking to his aide, and probably a 45-minute conversation while this plane was flying. And Johnson said, we have to get this railroad strike settled or it'll break the country. And it was so interesting because you knew that Johnson didn't think anybody was listening to him. So it wasn't just political BS, he was really telling the truth. And about 2 days later, that story appeared in the newspapers, which was kind of interesting because I, heard it in real time. And there was another conversation that I intercepted from one of Johnson's aides. Johnson was in South America, I forget the country. But the aide called back to Crown, which is what the White House was called. That's a nickname for the White House. The president is called Volunteer, still is today. So the aide called back to the White House, and President Johnson was going to be in a parade the next day. And the aide gave the exact time the parade would start, the exact route, how long he would be on a certain street. At the end of that street, would he turn right, would he turn left? Wow. And I'm thinking President Kennedy all over again.
Yeah.
And again, I'm thinking if I'm intercepting this and I'm recording this, then I knew somebody else was recording it too. And if the Russians wanted to knock Johnson off, all they had to do was pass that information off. So I wrote up the report, and I classified it secret, and I sent it off to the White House, and I sent it off to NSA, and I sent it off to CIA. So all those people knew about it, but I still think they went ahead with the parade anyway. But that Johnson didn't have a car that was secure or anything like that. He was in the open. And then there was a couple of other conversations that were kind of neat. There was another one I'll tell you about in a minute, but the most interesting thing, well, I guess the first thing I should tell you that probably due to the Air Force, it was probably the most impacting thing in my life. Because, as I mentioned earlier, some people know what they want to do when they get out of college. I did not. So when I was living in Hawaii, I got to travel to Okinawa, I got to travel to Japan, I traveled to Thailand, I traveled to the Philippines, I traveled to Vietnam for a few days. Even though I volunteered for Vietnam, I guess it was 3 times. The type of job that I had, they really didn't want us to be in country. Because if we knew our weaknesses in communications and we were captured somehow, everybody has a breaking point, I'm sure, but that information should not have fallen into the enemy's hands. But anyway, I did go to Vietnam, and the reason was that The SR-71, are you guys familiar with that at all?
Not really.
The SR-71 is the fastest production aircraft ever made. And it flew 3 times the speed of sound. And it was made by Lockheed. And you really ought to look it up, SR-71. It was the first of the stealth aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And you weren't even allowed to put your finger on it because your finger had oil, and that could possibly leave residue that could be picked up by some type of a radar operator.
Mm-hmm.
So this plane would leave Okinawa, and he would fly to the Gulf of Tonkin. And then he would be refueled. It took three tankers to refuel him. And the reason was that he used a different type of fuel than the tanker.
Mm-hmm.
So the tanker had to have its fuel separate. And then there was like this bladder bag for the SR-71.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it took 3 tankers.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy would refuel in the Gulf of Tonkin, and then he would take off and go over Hanoi and Haiphong, and they would turn on all their radar sites.
Mm-hmm.
Our guys would then pick up their radar sites, and they would do what they call DF. So if you have one radar site here, or one place that's looking for a radar site beam, and another place is looking for a radar site beam, they figure out the angle, and they can know exactly where that radar site is.
Gotcha.
So then we would send in bombers and try to blow it up. So that was the purpose of the SR-71. Plus he took pictures. So then he would come back to the Gulf of Tonkin. He would be refueled again with 3 aircraft. Go back over Hanoi and Haiphong again, and then come back, be refueled, and then return to Okinawa. So he was under the command of the Strategic Air Command. And the Strategic Air Command had indications that the North Vietnamese and the Russians were doing everything they could to shoot this guy down.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a feeling that there was a weakness in the chain of command. How was the pilot notified that he had a mission coming up? Was it over the radio? Was it by phone? Was it eyeball to eyeball, knocking on the door, stuff like that? How did the people in Vietnam, the tanker people, know that he was coming? So who was communicating to whom? Was it over secure methods? Was it non-secure methods? And so that's the mission that took me all over to these different countries, because anybody that had any contact with this plane, we got to interview these people. How do you know this is an SR-71? What was his call sign? So we had all this information, but so we gathered all this stuff up after talking to all these different people that had radar, that were radar operators basically. Then we came back to Okinawa, and we interviewed the colonel who was in charge of the SR-71 operation. His name was Colonel Tiemann. I'll never forget the guy. He was a young guy. What he was called a full bull. That means he was a full colonel, not a lieutenant colonel, but just a colonel. I'm sure he ended up being a general someday, or sooner or later. But he was young, he was very aggressive. And so we sat down with him, and he wanted to know where we had been. And so we told him all the different places, Thailand and places like that. He said, "What was the purpose of your mission?" And we were surprised that SAC, the Strategic Air Command, had not told him about our mission. And one of the people who was in our group, they said, "Well, Colonel, aren't you aware of why we are here?" And he said, "I'm not aware." And he said, "I expect you to tell me." So we're thinking, well, not me, I was an enlisted guy, but there was a couple of officers there. And so they were reluctant to basically tell him what we knew
Mm.
And he finally said, gentlemen, if you know something about my operation that can affect my planes or my pilots, and you're not telling me, he said, I consider you to be derelict in your duty. And wow, that got the attention of our guys right away. So they told him everything that we found out, any weaknesses that we found out. So he listened to our whole story, and he said, all right, he said, then let me ask you guys a question. He said, what do you know about reconnaissance missions? And we really didn't know anything about reconnaissance missions. We knew about code breaking and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
but we didn't know about how these things were actually managed. And he said, that plane, when he takes off and goes to the Gulf of Tonkin, he said he flies right over a Russian trawler that's sitting off Okinawa. He said, now do you think that Russian trawler is fishing? And we said, no. He said, he's not. He said, the moment that plane flies over that trawler, they pick up their phone and they call North Vietnam and they say he's coming.
Mm-hmm.
So he also said that we only fly over Hanoi and Haiphong between the hours of 11 and 1 o'clock. So what would be the reason for that? What would you guys think?
Because everybody's sleeping?
11 in the morning,
Oh.
1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Everybody like off to lunch?
That'd be a good answer.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
He said it has to do with shadows. He said when you take pictures before 11 and after 1, he said the shadows give you a different image. And he said, so we have to take these pictures within this certain time frame. So his first mission, he was over there, over Hanoi and Haiphong at 11 o'clock, and he came back, again, pretty fast. He went so fast that his wingtips glowed red.
Wow.
So that's pretty fast. So we learned so much about this that we didn't really find a weakness in their communications. But we did learn more about the operation itself. And he said, so any time that the people in North Vietnam see 3 tankers orbiting,
Mm-hmm.
they know the guy's coming.
Mm-hmm.
But he flew so high that the MiGs would go up as high as they could, which I think was 35,000 or 40,000 feet, and they would shoot a missile at him. But he had regular wings on his plane. And so that pilot, all they had to do, when you're flying at 65, 70,000, 80,000 feet, all SR-71 pilots had astronaut wings. That meant that they flew high enough where they were almost out of the stratosphere. And if a missile came up, missiles don't have big wings.
Mm-hmm.
They're short wings. So all this pilot had to do was just move that aircraft in a little bit slightly different direction. And the missile wasn't able to adjust because there was no air up there.
Oh, yeah.
And the missile would just fly right on by.
Wow.
So it was really a fascinating story. And then about 3 months after that, one day my boss came in and he gave me this radio traffic. And he said, Larry, he said, I want you to analyze this. He said, it has to do with the SR-71. So I read it, and there was 2 colonels that were talking back and forth, and one colonel said to the other, I understand you lost one of the blackbirds last night. That's what they call it, the blackbird. And the other colonel said, yeah. He said, we have the C-130s out looking for them now. And he said that they're doing a creeping line search. And so we had to figure out what a creeping line search was.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote up this report, and I said, it looks like they lost an SR-71, and this information should not have been revealed in the open like that. So wrote it up, my boss took it, sent it off to Security Service Headquarters, I'm sure. And about 2 months later, he came into my office and he sat down and he said, remember that report you wrote up on the SR-71? And I said, yeah. He said, the whole thing was made up. And I said, why? That's really interesting. He said they did that so that if the Russians intercepted those conversations, which we knew that they did, they would be thinking, well, how come we didn't see this plane crash? You know, they had radar, they had planes that were up. So all it was a means of letting them know that just because you hear it on the radio or you hear it on the telephone doesn't necessarily mean it's actually true. So
That's crazy.
it's kind of an interesting story.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So how long, you said 4 years you were in the Air Force doing that. Very cool. And so you said Hawaii, Japan, Okinawa, and the
Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, I went there because they also, any country that had anything to do with that plane, whether it was a radar site saying, okay, we're handing him off to you now, then we had to interview all those different places. So it was just it was a trip, it was a dream come true for me.
Yeah.
And just meeting all these different people. There was one lady that I met in Thailand, I'll never forget her. I don't know her name, and I couldn't remember what she looked like, but I had there was a jewelry store next to our hotel, and they also sold Seiko watches. And so Seiko watches were brand new at that time. Everybody wanted a Seiko watch. It's like an Apple Watch today. So I went into this store, and they sold jewelry and they sold antiques. And this lady came up to me. If the hotel was a Trocadero hotel, it's still there. And she said, you know, how may I help you? And I said, well, I want to get some Seiko watches and I want to get a couple of pieces of jewelry. But I said, I see that you have antiques. And she said, yes, we do. She said, what dynasty would you like to see? And it just kind of hit me like, dynasty, you know? And I said to her, I said, you know, and it's funny in the United States, I said, if something is 50 years old, it's considered an antique. And I said, you're asking me about dynasties. And fortunately, I was able to remember the word Ming. And she said, oh, that's this entire aisle here. It's all Ming Dynasty stuff. And I wouldn't know Ming Dynasty from the Han Dynasty. But it really hit me at that particular time, and I had about 6 months to go before I got out of the service, how little I knew about the rest of the world when she said that. And just going to all these different places, it piqued my interest. That's the catalyst that I needed to get me to want to go to college after the Air Force. And since the government was going to pay for it, why not do it?
No doubt. That's awesome. So what would you say was like your most fond memory of your time serving?
Definitely that mission.
Okay.
Yeah, the SR-71. I mean, I think about it today, and it's a story I can tell. And there was a couple of other things that impacted me. I got to read a couple of really interesting documents, but they were more about World War II. One was called the Seaborn Report, and that was by a Colonel Seaborn. How much time have we got?
We are at like 27 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'll tell you about these two reports. Seaborn Report was done by Colonel Seaborn, and after World War II, he went to all the countries that we defeated, and he talked to their code breakers, and he wanted to find out what codes had they broken of ours, and how did they end up doing it, which is really interesting. And the other report was called the Seaborn Report, or the War in the Ether. And that was really a compilation of all the radio interception done by all the different countries and the styles that each one had. Like how did the Germans operate? If the British dropped in a spy, how did the Germans pick up the spy? How did they end up capturing him? How did they get them, how did they break him eventually? It was just an incredible thing to read.
That's very cool.
And they were both considered secret documents, and I've never seen them declassified yet.
Wow,
So
that's crazy.
yeah.
That's very cool. I guess what you said, you definitely wanted to go to college. What was one other thing other than going to college that you took away from being in the Air Force?
Camaraderie.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you're with guys that you'll never have that type of a relationship again with anybody, even with your wife. It's just you really are a band of brothers, you know. I mean, and I guess the guys in combat probably have more of that sense because they really do have to watch each other's back. But if you work in a small group as I did, you really are attached to your fellow airmen.
No, I can definitely get that. That is so incredible.
Yeah.
Larry, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming in today and doing this interview. I know I had a great time listening to it. I think it's all very interesting.
Great.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much. And that is all we have. I mean, do you have any other things that you'd like to say?
No, I'm you know, as I said, it was the one thing that impacted my life more than anything else. And it showed me things that I could never dream of, and go to places I would have never dreamed of going, certainly. Opened up a lot of doors for me. And I got to read some things that nobody else could read. So.
That's awesome.
So like at your school, is there anybody who's going into the military that you know?
Know
yeah.
a couple people.
Yeah,
we have a kid going to West Point, and then
Oh, really? Wow.
yes, and then we have another person going under ROTC to Iowa.
We'll finish.
We'll finish.